Picture yourself waking up 170,000 years ago on the African savannah. The morning air is cool, the grass still damp with dew, and somewhere beyond the horizon, a herd is already moving. Your first thoughts are about water, food, predators, and the people around you. At no point does your mind wander to jackets, shoes, or whether today's animal hide matches your accessories. Clothing simply doesn't exist as an idea. There is nothing strange about your bare skin because everyone you have ever known looks exactly the same. Now compare that to your own morning. Before you've even stepped outside, you've already made a decision that almost every person on Earth repeats every single day. You got dressed. Not only is it expected, but in many societies it's legally required. Entire industries, cultures, and even governments revolve around what people wear. We judge professions, celebrate milestones, signal status, express identity, and sometimes even break laws based on clothing. It feels so natural that we rarely stop to ask the obvious question. Why are humans the only animals that need a second skin? After all, wolves survive freezing winters without coats. Elephants endure blazing heat without shirts. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, have never woven fabric or stitched together animal hides. So why did our ancestors do something no other species ever did? And if clothing was invented simply to stay warm, why does the evidence suggest humans were already wearing it tens of thousands of years before they left the warm landscapes of Africa? Answering that mystery takes us through one of evolution's strangest detective stories. The clues aren't hidden inside ancient wardrobes or forgotten caves alone. They also lie inside parasites, scattered archaeological discoveries, and the peculiar biology of a primate that abandoned its fur long before it learned to weave fabric. Somewhere between losing our natural coat and inventing our artificial one, our ancestors transformed from just another ape into the only creature on Earth that could literally redesign its own body. To understand why humans eventually invented clothing, you first have to understand why we became one of the strangest mammals on the planet. Long before anyone stitched together an animal hide or wrapped plant fibers around their body, our ancestors had already undergone a transformation that almost no other large mammal ever experienced. We lost our fur. That may not sound remarkable until you compare us with the rest of the animal kingdom. Gorillas are covered in thick hair, chimpanzees are covered in thick hair. Lions, wolves, horses, even elephants all carry some form of natural protection against the environment. Yet, humans stand apart, with smooth skin interrupted only by scattered patches of hair, looking less like a typical mammal and more like an unfinished one. Evolution rarely throws away a useful feature without offering something better in return. What it offered was one of the greatest endurance systems nature has ever produced. As early humans began leaving dense forests for the open African savanna, survival depended less on explosive speed and more on relentless stamina. Rather than sprinting after prey, our ancestors practiced persistence hunting, tracking an animal for hours under the blazing sun until it simply overheated and collapsed from exhaustion. This strategy demanded a body that could stay cool while every other predator was forced to stop and pant. Instead of relying on fur, humans evolved between 2 and 4 million sweat glands spread across nearly every inch of the body. As sweat evaporated, it carried heat away with it, turning the human body into an extraordinarily efficient cooling system. Few animals can match this ability, which is why people can run surprisingly long distances even in extreme heat. But every evolutionary advantage comes with a price. By shedding our insulating coat, we solved the problem of overheating while creating an entirely new one. A body perfectly designed for scorching afternoons suddenly became vulnerable after sunset, during storms, and in cooler seasons. We had traded one survival challenge for another, and if freezing temperatures weren't yet part of the story, what finally convinced our ancestors to cover their newly exposed skin? The answer to that question remained invisible for tens of thousands of years because clothing itself almost never survives. Animal hides rot, plant fibers decay, leather disappears. Unless preserved in extraordinary conditions such as ice or extremely dry caves, the first garments leave almost no trace behind. Archaeologists can recover stone tools that are millions of years old, but the very thing those tools may have been used to create is usually long gone. It seemed as though the origin of clothing had vanished forever. Ironically, the breakthrough came from one of humanity's least welcome companions. Researchers studying human lice noticed something peculiar. Not all lice are the same. Head lice spend their entire lives clinging to human hair, feeding and reproducing there from generation to generation. Body lice, however, live very differently. Rather than remaining on the skin, they hide in the seams and folds of clothing, crawling onto the body only long enough to feed before retreating back into the fabric. That distinction changes everything. Body lice cannot establish a permanent population on people who do not regularly wear clothes. Without fabric to shelter in, they simply cannot survive. In evolutionary terms, they occupy an ecological niche that exists only because humans created it. Long before archaeologists uncovered convincing evidence of the earliest garments, these tiny parasites had already been preserving the answer inside their own DNA. By comparing the genomes of head lice and body lice, geneticists discovered that the two populations shared a common ancestor before splitting into separate evolutionary lineages. Using molecular dating techniques, they estimated that this divergence occurred sometime between roughly 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. In other words, body lice appeared only after clothing became common enough to support an entirely new species of parasite. It's an astonishing piece of evolutionary detective work. Instead of asking when humans first wore clothes, scientists asked when lice first moved into them. The parasites recorded a chapter of our history that the clothes themselves could never preserve. Yet the timeline raised an even bigger mystery. Those dates are significantly older than the major migration of modern humans out of Africa, which began around 70,000 years ago. If people were already wearing clothing while still living in relatively warm environments, then surviving freezing winters could not have been the original reason. If early clothes weren't primarily invented to fight the cold, then what exactly were our ancestors wearing them for? The simplest explanation is often the best place to begin. Early clothing probably started as protection, not against blizzards or glaciers, but against the everyday hazards of life on the African savannah. Hours spent beneath an unforgiving sun exposed bare skin to intense ultraviolet radiation. Tall grasses concealed razor-sharp seed heads that sliced at ankles and legs. Thorn bushes tore at exposed flesh, while biting insects carried irritation, disease, and infection. Even a loosely draped animal hide or woven plant covering could make daily life safer and more comfortable. The first garments may have been crude, but they solved real problems. Yet humans have always been unusual in one important respect. We rarely leave a useful invention as merely useful. Long before the oldest evidence for regular clothing, our ancestors were already decorating their bodies. Archaeological discoveries show that people were collecting and grinding red ochre as early as 200,000 years ago, deliberately covering their skin with pigment. Ochre offered some practical benefits, including limited protection against sunlight and insects, but its widespread and repeated use suggests something deeper. It became a way of communicating without words. Imagine meeting another group on the open savanna. Before anyone speaks, you notice the colors painted across their faces, the patterns on their bodies, the confidence with which they carry themselves. Those markings could signal family, alliances, experience, or perhaps even achievements that everyone in the community understood. The human body had become a canvas long before it became a wardrobe. Once animal hides entered that picture, the transition was almost inevitable. A skin wrapped around the shoulders was no longer just a barrier against thorns. It could also tell a story. Was it the hide of a dangerous predator? Had the wearer hunted it themselves? Was a particular style reserved for respected elders or skilled hunters? The practical purpose remained, but another layer of meaning quietly emerged alongside it. This is one of the defining characteristics of our species. Humans instinctively transform objects into symbols. A tool becomes a badge of expertise. A color becomes an identity. A piece of clothing becomes a message about who we are and where we belong. And once our ancestors realized that what they wore could communicate as much as it could protect, they began finding better ways to make it. For countless generations, clothing was probably little more than a hide thrown over the shoulders or wrapped around the waist. It offered protection, but only up to a point. Loose skins shifted as people walked, opened gaps that let precious body heat escape, and became awkward during long journeys. As humans ventured into harsher landscapes, simply wearing an animal skin was no longer enough. Survival demanded something better. That improvement arrived in the form of an invention so small it could fit in the palm of your hand, yet so important that it transformed where our species could live: the sewing needle. Around 50,000 years ago, the archaeological record begins revealing finely crafted bone needles with carefully drilled eyes, designed specifically for threading sinew or plant fibers. One of the oldest confirmed examples was discovered in Denisova cave in Siberia, fashioned from the hollow bone of a bird with astonishing precision. It wasn't merely sharpened, it was shaped, polished, perforated, and engineered for a purpose that required remarkable foresight. Creating such a tool demanded far more than manual skill. Someone first had to imagine that two separate pieces of hide could become a single fitted garment if joined with hundreds of tiny, deliberate stitches. They had to understand materials, anticipate how leather would flex around the body, and produce a tool delicate enough to pass thread through a hole scarcely wider than a grain of sand without splitting the bone itself. This was engineering long before anyone had a word for it. The result was revolutionary. Instead of draping hides over the body, people could tailor clothing that wrapped closely around the wrists, neck, and ankles, trapping layers of warm air where they mattered most. A well-sewn garment conserved heat far more effectively than a loose animal skin ever could. In freezing environments, decoration became secondary. Fit meant survival. That seemingly simple leap from wrapping to stitching allowed humans to push into landscapes that would otherwise have been uninhabitable, carrying their portable shelter wherever they went. Yet Homo sapiens were not the only humans clever enough to solve this problem. Long before our ancestors spread across Eurasia, other branches of the human family had already confronted the same environmental challenges and arrived at remarkably similar solutions. Neanderthals, who occupied Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, lived through some of the harshest ice age conditions imaginable. Archaeologists have uncovered abundant evidence that they systematically processed animal hides using specialized stone tools designed for scraping flesh and preparing leather. Their stocky bodies, shorter limbs, and broader chests were already adapted to conserving heat, but biology alone could never have been enough. In climates where winter temperatures routinely plunged below freezing, properly prepared clothing was as essential as fire itself. The mysterious Denisovans, known from only a handful of fossils yet preserved through their DNA, appear to have shared a similar ingenuity. In Denisova Cave, alongside evidence of sophisticated tools, researchers discovered ornaments crafted from bone and stone, hinting that these ancient people were not only surviving extreme environments but also expressing themselves through objects they created. Although direct evidence of their garments has vanished with time, the technology surrounding them suggests clothing was likely part of their everyday lives. This remarkable pattern is an example of convergent evolution, not of bodies, but of ideas. Separate human groups, isolated across vast landscapes, independently developed methods for preparing hides, making garments, and adapting to hostile environments. Faced with the same problems, intelligent minds repeatedly reached similar conclusions. That raises an intriguing possibility. Perhaps clothing was never a uniquely Homo sapiens invention at all. Perhaps any highly social, tool-making primate living in a demanding world would eventually create a second skin of its own. But once clothing had secured humanity's survival, it began evolving into something far more powerful than protection alone. As clothing became more reliable, something remarkable happened. It stopped being merely a solution to the environment and became a way of communicating with other people. A stitched hide no longer answered only the question, how do I stay alive? It also began answering a very different one. Who am I? Across human history, garments gradually acquired meanings that extended far beyond their practical purpose. Certain materials became associated with respected hunters, skilled craftspeople, or community leaders. Particular colors, ornaments, and patterns could distinguish one group from another long before a single word was spoken. What had begun as protection against the elements evolved into one of the earliest forms of visual language. This symbolic role expanded alongside increasingly complex societies. Clothing became intertwined with ritual and belief. Ceremonial garments marked important moments in life, from coming-of-age traditions to marriages and religious gatherings. Even death carried its own dress code. Archaeological burials from later prehistoric societies reveal individuals carefully laid to rest with ornaments, decorated garments, and objects that reflected their identity in life, suggesting that what a person wore continued to matter even after they were gone. Color also took on new significance. Pigments that had once decorated bare skin were now applied to hides, fibers, and woven textiles. A garment could announce membership, authority, grief, celebration, or spiritual devotion without a single spoken sentence. Humans had transformed clothing into a sophisticated system of symbols, one that allowed entire communities to recognize status, relationships, and shared traditions at a glance. No other species uses external objects in quite this way. Birds may display brilliant feathers, and cuttlefish can change color in an instant, but those signals are encoded by biology. Human clothing is different. It is chosen, learned, modified, and passed from one generation to the next. Every garment carries cultural memory stitched into its seams. For thousands of years, symbolism and survival developed side by side, each shaping the other. But the balance between them was about to shift dramatically. As the climate grew colder and the world became increasingly unpredictable, identity alone could no longer keep people alive. Once the Ice Age tightened its grip, symbolism wasn't enough. Survival demanded clothing that could withstand a far harsher world. As global climates shifted between roughly 120,000 and 70,000 years ago, the challenges facing our ancestors became far more severe than avoiding thorns or signaling identity. Massive ice sheets expanded across the northern hemisphere, rainfall patterns changed, and large regions of Africa became increasingly dry. Lakes shrank, familiar ecosystems disappeared, and food grew scarce. Genetic evidence suggests the human population may have fallen to only a few tens of thousands of individuals. Our species came remarkably close to disappearing before it had fully spread across the world. For the groups that endured, clothing was no longer an advantage. It was a necessity. The difference between surviving and freezing often came down to how effectively a garment trapped warm air against the body. A single loose hide offered some protection, but multiple fitted layers created pockets of insulation that dramatically reduced heat loss. Carefully stitched sleeves, collars, and leggings prevented cold air from reaching the skin, while durable footwear protected feet crossing frozen ground. Combined with fire and shelter, clothing became part of a complete survival system that allowed humans to remain active even in conditions that would otherwise have been fatal. That technological advantage changed the course of history. Communities equipped with the knowledge to prepare hides, stitch garments, and repair them season after season could move beyond the environments where humans had first evolved. They crossed mountain ranges, entered windswept steppes, and eventually settled landscapes stretching across Europe and deep into Asia. Instead of waiting for their bodies to evolve thicker fur or new physiological adaptations, they altered their environment by carrying protection with them. In many ways, clothing became humanity's first portable habitat. Wherever people traveled, they brought with them a second skin that extended the limits of what the human body alone could endure. It was one of the defining innovations that allowed our species to occupy deserts, forests, tundra, and eventually nearly every corner of the planet. And once survival was no longer the only concern, clothing entered an entirely new chapter. Humans began looking beyond animal hides, experimenting with the materials growing all around them. Plant fibers were twisted into thread, thread was woven into fabric, and fabric could be shaped into garments that were lighter, more flexible, and easier to produce than leather alone. What had started as an adaptation to nature was becoming a technology capable of reshaping society itself. Over thousands of years, different civilizations mastered different materials. Linen emerged from cultivated flax, wool came from domesticated sheep, cotton flourished in warmer regions, and silk, produced through one of history's most remarkable discoveries, became so valuable that it linked distant civilizations across continents. Each new fiber expanded what clothing could do, making it more comfortable, more specialized, and more expressive. As textile production grew, it transformed economies as profoundly as agriculture or metalworking. Weaving became a skilled profession. Entire communities specialized in spinning, dyeing, and producing cloth. Trade routes carried fabrics across deserts, mountains, and seas, connecting cultures that otherwise might never have met. Some of history's greatest empires accumulated enormous wealth by controlling the production and exchange of textiles, while luxury fabrics became symbols of political power and social prestige. Clothing itself also became increasingly specialized. Instead of owning a single garment for every situation, people developed wardrobes suited to different aspects of life. There were clothes for work, for ceremonies, for travel, for warfare, for mourning, and for celebration. A person's occupation, beliefs, wealth, and place within society could often be understood long before they spoke. What began as a simple layer between skin and the environment had become one of civilization's foundational technologies. It fueled commerce, shaped cultures, inspired innovation, and connected distant peoples through shared craftsmanship. Few inventions have influenced human history so completely, quietly weaving themselves into every aspect of daily life. So why did ancient humans start wearing clothes? The evidence suggests there was never a single moment or a single reason. Clothing evolved because each generation solved a different problem. It probably began as protection from the sun, thorns, and biting insects. As human societies became more complex, those same coverings turned into symbols of identity, status, and belonging. When the climate grew harsher, clothing became a survival technology that allowed our ancestors to cross frozen landscapes and settle environments their bodies alone could never have endured. And from there, it grew into one of the foundations of civilization itself. Perhaps that's the most remarkable part of the story. Clothes didn't simply cover the human body, they changed what it meant to be human. Every morning when you decide what to wear, you're participating in a tradition that stretches back roughly 150,000 years. The jacket hanging by your door, your favorite pair of shoes, even the color of the shirt you chose without much thought are all echoes of a behavior that began around campfires on the African savannah. Just as our ancestors once painted their bodies with ochre and wrapped themselves in carefully chosen hides, we continue to tell the world who we are before we ever say a word. We invented a second skin, and in many ways, it became inseparable from the first. So the next time you get dressed, remember, you aren't just putting on clothes. You're continuing one of the oldest traditions in human history. And what do you think was the biggest reason our ancestors first started wearing clothes? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.